Now we're going to look at some of the key factors to consider in contractual relationships. Most contractual relationships start with some form of communication. And contrary to what many believe, this doesn't have to be formal communication. It can be a casual conversation. So an example of formal communication would be contractual negotiations. Those are very clear that a contract is being considered. However, a contractual relationship can also start through something as innocuous as a general inquiry about the price of something or the availability of a product, or when two people from different organizations realize that they have mutual needs. It's important then to understand when communication becomes a legal obligation. In this context, in the business law context, communication of any kind is actually laden with legal meaning, even the most informal discussions. It's important to communicate clearly because contract law concerns itself with what the parties say and do, not what they think or imagine. If you tell someone you are selling your products for a certain price, the other side can accept the offer, even if it was intended as just a casual discussion. If the words used look like an offer and the other party accepts, the court may actually uphold the contract. When such a case gets to court, the judge will likely use something we call the objective standard test. This is where the judge considers whether a reasonable person observing the communication between the negotiators would conclude that an offer and acceptance has occurred. This notion of the reasonable person is used throughout law, and we're going to see it often as we continue your study of business law. The next thing you should consider is the bargaining power of the parties to a contract. So it would be ideal if everybody had equal bargaining power, but the reality is that this is rarely the case. Consider for a moment a small supplier who has a contract with a large big box store. The small supplier relies on the big box store for most of its sales. As you'd think, the big box store in this situation has much more bargaining power. And with greater bargaining power comes the ability to negotiate better terms. It's not ideal, but it's very much how the system works. The law, however, doesn't recognize or attach legal significance to this business reality. Instead, the court relies on the assumption that those who are in positions to create contracts are capable of looking out for themselves, and they'll maximize their own self-interest. As a result, courts are not likely to assess the fairness and reasonableness of the contractual terms that the two parties have chosen. We call this the principle of equality of bargaining power, despite the fact that this is rarely the case. The upshot is this: parties are expected to take care of themselves in most cases. Now we're going to take a look at where this principle is applied. This is the case of Churchill Falls versus Hydro-Quebec. You may have heard about this in the news. This was an important case, and there were other important factors and rules established by this case, but we're just going to focus on the bargaining power. So this case concerns a contract for a 65-year term between Churchill Falls and Hydro-Quebec. Basically, it obligated Churchill Falls to sell nearly all of its power to Hydro-Quebec, and obligated Hydro-Quebec to purchase that entire output. So this was a really long-term contract, 65 years, and it had a set price. And this price didn't include a market adjustment clause. This meant that if the price of power went up, the price for Hydro-Quebec stayed the same. The value of energy increased significantly in this case, and Hydro-Quebec benefited greatly. They were able to resell the energy at significantly higher prices. So, for example, they got $27 billion, but Churchill Falls only made $2 billion. The legal dispute arose because Churchill Falls felt like it was entitled to more and that Hydro-Quebec should be forced to renegotiate. And so what I've done for you on the screen is I've identified the legal question. In this case, the legal question is, does Hydro-Quebec have a duty to act in good faith such that it must renegotiate the pricing under agreement? This went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the contract was upheld. Hydro-Quebec did not need to renegotiate. Now, the court considered many factors, including that Hydro-Quebec had absorbed most of the risk related to financing and construction costs of the Churchill Falls project. As well, Churchill Falls would own the plant, worth about $20 billion at the end of the contract. But really, the court focused on the notion here that the parties are expected to take care of themselves. The legal rules resulting from this case are that a deal is a deal, and the courts will not lightly interfere with the bargain that the parties have freely struck. Sometimes the court will intervene and come to the assistance of the weaker party, but it should be noted that this is rare, and it wasn't the case with Churchill Falls and Hydro-Quebec. Parties are expected to take care of themselves, and the court doesn't look at the relative bargaining power of each of the parties. The last thing we're going to look at in this session is breach of contract. In reality, businesses often breach contracts. Can you think of some examples? Consider this. Have you ever ordered something online and when you got it, it wasn't how it was advertised? This is a breach. Other examples would be organizations that pay late when an incorrect product is delivered. It includes defective products, late delivery, and failure to perform as contracted. When these things occur, the question then arises about how the injured party should proceed. When you ordered something online and it came and it wasn't as advertised, did you sue them? Not likely. As we've discussed, litigation is often not the best approach. Business relationships need to be considered as well. And since the business relationship is as important to how the parties interact as the contract itself, a strictly legal focus would be short-sighted. When we're considering two businesses where a breach has occurred, we need to consider other factors, including the economic reality surrounding the transaction, as well as the need for a business to manage its reputation for reliability and commitment to its word. The reputation of a business is quite possibly its most valuable asset in the long term. Focusing too much on legal rights and obligations might harm that reputation. Before we finish this session, I want to touch briefly on a specific type of breach, known as an economic breach. It occurs when one party calculates that it's actually more financially rewarding to breach the contract in question than to perform it. I'll give you an example. Let's say you own an apple orchard. You have a contract with a bakery to sell them 20 bushels of apples at a specific price. Later on, you're contacted by a large company that wishes to buy all of your apples at a slightly better price. You might calculate your profits and realize that you'd make more money selling to the large company, even if the court awarded the bakery damages for the breach. You see, contract law provides damages for losses, not punishment. This means that the court might order you to pay damages to the bakery if they somehow suffered financially by your breach. Let's say they had to pay more for the apples from someone else. In that case, the court may order that you pay the bakery the difference in profits. So, a business that is prepared to pay damages for breach of contract can always refuse to perform its contractual obligations, and sometimes it's even more financially rewarding to breach the contract in question than to perform it. However, profits should not be the only thing that is considered. There are many factors that are relevant to the decision to observe a contract or to break it when the circumstances change. For example, relationships, reputation, and ethics need to be considered. The cost of a bad reputation, for example, is not easy to calculate. Presumably, parties don't make commitments they don't intend to carry through on, but many things may change during the terms of a contract. There could be new opportunities, changing market conditions, the ability to produce or sell, and whether a breach is economic or not can be a tricky question. Businesses should be cautioned against pursuing what seems to be an economic breach because it can be really difficult to predict the real cost of breach and what the new contract must be worth to offset that loss. So in terms of the apples, we can't just consider the damages we might have to pay the bakery, but what if word gets out in our community that we breach contracts when we can make a little bit more money elsewhere? This may induce other buyers to look elsewhere if we can't be trusted. As you're going to come to know throughout this course, I'm a big fan of just doing the right thing simply because it's the right thing to do. However, this isn't something you'll find in many business law textbooks, but I think it's incredibly important. Dollars and cents are not the only thing to consider. That's it for this session. As always, don't hesitate to get in touch if you'd like to get clarification on something. You'll hear from me again soon.